Welcome to the BLS Ground Crew podcast. Before we dive into today's topic, a quick disclaimer. While I am a certified advanced EMT, I am not a physician. The content in this episode is for educational purposes only and should never be taken as direct medical advice. The views expressed in this podcast do not reflect the views of my employers and are my opinions only. Always refer to your local medical direction and protocols. Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of the BLS Ground Crew podcast. This is actually our very first episode. If you found this episode, you went through any other number of podcasts and chose this one and scrolled all the way down to the bottom to listen to the very first episode, and we are so happy that you are here. Now, what is the point of this podcast? The BLS Ground Crew oftentimes gets overlooked in EMS. There are much more gaudy, much more sparkly provider levels in EMS, but at the very base fundamental level is the BLS provider. And that BLS provider is associated with a ground crew. There are many, many great content providers for EMS, but a lot of those content providers focus on paramedic level intervention. And that's what this podcast hopes to be the antithesis of. We want to talk about what the BLS provider can do in certain situations. We want to talk about what any level provider can do in certain situations. From time to time, we will talk about what paramedic level interventions are indicated in certain situations, but the expectation is not that you are out there doing paramedic level interventions. The goal is that you understand what paramedic level interventions are available to you and when might be a good time to look into them. EMS is such a huge spectrum of different disorders, and many of those disorders are easily treated with BLS or ILS, intermediate life support level treatments. It does happen that a paramedic level intervention is indicated and can sometimes be required. But for the purposes of this podcast, we're going to talk about BLS and ILS ground crew level treatments. So that's why this podcast is called the BLS Ground Crew podcast. The goal of this podcast is to help new providers learn and to help students study and to help old providers remember new things and stay up to date with the topics and the studies that are coming out that are showing the changes that are happening all the time in EMS. If you don't know this already, EMS is changing all the time. Medicine constantly comes out with new studies dictate that we should change the way we treat patients. And this happens on a very, very regular basis. EMS is changing all the time. And that is another purpose of this podcast, to stay up to date, but also to establish the fundamentals. 20 or 30 years ago, backboards were indicated for every single patient that had any sort of traumatic injury. Nowadays, we don't backboard very often, and we use a totally different tool to help us perform spinal immobilization. Things like that are changing all the time. EMTs are getting more privileges or different privileges, and privileges are changing for those provider levels all the time. So the purpose of this podcast is to review, renew, and educate providers of all levels and all experience levels. Providers who have been in the business for a really long time and providers who are brand new. Just to introduce myself, my name is Kyler. I'm an advanced EMT in Utah. I'm also an instructor. So I teach students and I see the things that they struggle with. And I feel like that's going to be really helpful in this situation to help you guys understand things that you might be struggling with. I also volunteered in the fire service for about 7 years. I have a background in software engineering. That's my day job. I'm a volunteer on an ambulance service. Currently, I don't think there's any shame in that. A lot of America runs on volunteerism. It's super important. If it weren't for the volunteer EMTs in my area, we wouldn't have an EMS service. And the same can be said about many areas across the United States. This podcast is really for the underdog, the BLS provider, the volunteer, and for people who are trying to learn from the beginning everything that EMS requires. I think that's about all we need to talk about in this introductory episode, and I hope to see you in the next one.